When I'm in the situation of arguing postmodernism, I've made it a policy to ask myself two questions early on in the discussion. Okay? I always seem to picture myself in a bar about midnight with fellow graduate students arguing over beer. Okay? I had my first significant encounters with postmodernism in graduate school. Most of graduate school goes on in the bars, not the library. So I think that made a lasting impression. Now the two questions are, when I'm judging my interlocutor, first, is this person honest? Okay. And second, what matters most to this person? Okay. The first is important because it's easy to waste a lot of time discussing things with people who aren't really interested in thinking something through. They may seem to enjoy debate initially, but it's a game. Right? They're not really open to having their premises challenged or to think through their assumptions. The mark of this is almost always evasiveness, switching the subject when hot water is sensed. And it's just not worth it to pursue if your idea is to get to the truth here. Life is short. Now there's an exception here, especially when you're early in your career. If you want to sharpen your debating skills, then go for it. Or if you want to just really get a concrete image of how evasive people can be and learn to spot evasiveness, okay? Do it. Okay? The second question is, what matters most to this person? This question allows you to focus most effectively your time that you spend in the debate. For an example, any discussion about postmodernism is going to wander from politics to historical claims to epistemological claims about interpretation, relativism, and subjectivism. Now here's my bold claim. 95% of the time, the politics is what matters most to your interlocutor. So focus on that. Okay? The epistemology and whether the Aztecs really performed sacrifices, those are way secondary. Okay? They're window dressing. Okay? In my experience, if you're arguing with postmodernists, especially in English literature, law, and history, they didn't come to postmodernism via epistemology. They had a political agenda, and they only later backed into relativistic epistemology. So you're not going to change anyone's minds by proving that the census are valid or that Columbus was a nicer guy than Montezuma. Okay? There's a follow-up point here about focusing on the politics. And here I would recommend that you emphasize the positive. By that I mean focus on the case for capitalism and liberalism and de-emphasize arguing against socialism. Both of these need to be done, but not only is it more enjoyable to focus on talking about why capitalism is so great, it's more effective. Socialists are usually well aware of the problems of socialism, so mentioning them is fine just to show them that you know what they are, so that's not going to make the case for capitalism. Socialism often gets much of its impetus from a failure to visualize any alternative. In part, this is driven by traditional mischaracterizations of capitalism. So hammer home the successes of the Enlightenment philosophy, medicine, standard of living, freedom, extension of the franchise, etc. There's lots and lots of data available, and these things can be used to great effect in debate. And hammer home especially the individualism that lies beneath the liberal capitalistic vision. The importance of being an end in yourself, setting your own goals, figuring out the means, prizing one's creativity, ingenuity, and responsibility. These are all the things that capitalism protects and nurtures, and these are the things that get people turned on, much more than a dismal listing of socialism's failings. All right, I have emphasized the politics and the psychology and de-emphasized the epistemology in dealing with postmodernism. Nonetheless, the epistemology is crucial, and the technical work in epistemology needs to be done and marketed effectively. And I think here objectivism has a unique voice. Without that, the philosophical world will be chronically subject to subjectivism, and in a climate of subjectivism, some future irrationalist cultural movement will rise up to take advantage of it. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I can't tell you how good that makes me feel.
Okay, Steve, you talked a little bit about the what almost appears to be the personal characteristics of some of the leading postmodernists. Has anybody done any systematic analysis of them in comparison of these folks to try and illustrate more what their defects really are as people, as human beings? My sense is that that actually may be something that could be constructive in terms of trying to focus more on these people and their failures, their failings as individuals. I mean, you've touched on it, but it seems to me that it's useful to try and get at the psychology of these people. I mean, in effect, what's wrong with them? Why do they feel this bitterness, this alienation? What are the causes of it? As much as anything else, to help other people kind of maybe steer away from those characteristics.
Right. Well, it's obviously a very sensitive subject to raise within the academy. Right? When you start questioning people's motives, you open the door to turning everything into ad hominem debate. I mean, debate is just going to shut down as soon as that becomes part of the academy. So people will shy away from it. In the public writings and the public lectures, what you will get then is an emphasis on arguing against the relativism. And it's not so much that you're trying to refute to refute the postmodernists to the postmodernists. Your audience is some other group of people, and you just say, this is what postmodernism leads to, it's ridiculous, and so don't you believe this as well. But you're quite right, though, that knowing that it's not just a philosophical movement, that it's also a psychological phenomenon that's going on, this can and should be very helpful to people in dealing with it, with them. And I don't think there's anything systematic that has been done. The only thing that comes to mind as partly approximating that project is a book by Paul Johnson called Intellectuals. Came out, I'm not sure how long ago, 8-10 years ago. And what he does is he goes through and he takes people like Rousseau and some of the 19th century utopian socialists and Marx and some of the Fabian socialists, and I think Bertrand Russell is in there as well. And they're all pretty much left politics, and he does show that that matched their personal lives, and that there was a lot of evidence that there was some destructive stuff going on in them psychologically. So I think it would be valuable to be done. I wonder how you could do it in the academy. Well, yes, sure, that's where, and I think that's where it does go on. Yeah, people are a little freer to, or in a friendly audience like this.
Steve, I think your analysis was fantastic, so thanks for a great job.
Thank you.
Since you ended with some debating tips, I thought I'd take the liberty of giving a couple of my own that I think mesh well with yours.
Please do.
I've had much more experience than I care to recall with debating these sort of people. The first is, but what about is not the beginning of an argument. There's no argument that begins, but what about the poor? Mm-hmm. But what about anything? Well, what about the environment? Very careful, if you want to debate successfully in here, you have to be very careful that when the ball's in their court, make sure you leave it there. Right? This is a tactic that I find them to use all the time. But what about the poor? And, well, but what about the poor? What am I supposed to say? The worst thing you can do is to jump on that and start giving some random flailings about the poor.
Right.
Right? Whatever comes to your mind. If they've got some concern about the poor, make them tell you what their concern is.
Right.
And that brings...
And also, if I could just add on that point, if you sense that what the person's strategy is, they've got a core disagreement with capitalism that's not going to be budged, and there's just a whole bunch of what about the poor, and there's going to be another what about as soon as you finish this one, right? Then don't go down that road. Try to figure out what that core thing is.
And I think that that's sort of a corollary of a more basic principle. When you're arguing with someone about convictions that differ, you should tell people what you think and the reasons that you think it. And they should be telling you what they think and the reasons that they think it. Not some argument that they once heard that they think kind of supports it, right? Not an argument that they hope might win, but you should ask people, you think that? I don't want to hear some abstract argument that you once heard, why you think that you think might work. I want to know, why do you think this is true? So that if I can refute that argument, you can't any longer think that it's true.
Right.
Okay? Because it's amazing how often I find myself saying to somebody, why do you think that? And they'll tell me. And I say, I refute it then, and they say, well, how about this?
Yeah.
Right? But what about the poor?
Right. Okay.
Anyway, those are my two tips. And
Right.
again,
So following
thanks.
up on the second one, I think it's the same spirit as that strategy is to get the person pinned down to something. Right. So your position is this. Right. And this is your most important argument against, say, capitalism or whatever. And then say, if I can show you that that argument doesn't work, are you going to change your mind? And they will say yes or no. All right. And then your options are obvious. Okay, your choice.